This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is June 20th, 2020. I'm producer Pat, and with me is Cristina Roach.
Hey, everyone.
Darren and Adam continue to record in isolation, but we still have three interesting segments for you today. Darren is going to talk to us about evidence and context, and Adam is going to look into whether the Mayans predicted that the world would end, tomorrow as we're recording this. But first, Cristina, do these COVID-19 temperature checks we're hearing about work?
Well, first, I should say that those Darren and Adam segments sounded very much like Darren and Adam segments. Right. During the second week of March, I was set to get on a plane to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan to attend the Juno Awards, in short, Canada's Grammys. A couple of days before the flight, the event was cancelled, like many others, due to COVID-19 concerns, and as we know, resulted in people around the world having to shelter at home to mitigate the spread of the virus. Fast forward to now, and numerous places have begun easing restrictions, with many looking to put safety measures in place to allow life as we knew it to get back to some semblance of normal. One of these measures is a temperature check. About a week ago, Dave Chappelle, a stand-up comic I've been a big fan of since the late 90s, released a powerful special filmed in Beaver Creek, Ohio, titled 846. It's named after the length of time a former Minneapolis police officer kneeled on George Floyd's neck, resulting in Mr. Floyd's death. The special was taped outside to a socially distanced audience who wore masks bearing Chappelle's logo. It was actually pretty cool. Everyone had enough space between their seats. There were circles around the seats, so it actually looked like they were doing a pretty good job of that.
Yeah, it was well done, for sure.
During the intro to the special, you can see people arriving, and as they arrive, a masked worker takes everyone's temperature using a no-touch infrared thermometer pointed at the forehead. In Tulsa, where Trump is holding a rally tonight, as we record this, a statement was released that before entering the facility, attendees would need to pass a temperature check. Okay, seeing this along with reading that retail stores and workplaces are implementing temperature checks, I couldn't help but wonder a few things. What happens if you have a fever? How reliable is this? Is this recorded somehow to track whether or not you get sick? Or try to get into another store? What exactly is the point of temperature checks? This is what happens when you've been on TRC a few years. There's a plethora of articles you can find with a quick search that take this on. Couple of headlines. Bloomberg, are temperature checks just COVID prevention theater? I love that line. Slate, what is the point of temperature checks? Mother Jones, temperature checks are becoming the new normal. Do they work? And are they setting a dangerous precedent? Associated Press, will temperature checks of employees make workplaces safe? You guys get the picture. Taking one's temperature seems like the current panacea on how to manage opening for business during a pandemic. In the Bloomberg article, writer Stephen Carter, who's a Yale University law professor, says the New York Stock Exchange will not let anyone onto the floor if they have a fever. Carter states that he had his temperature taken twice at his doctor's office, upon arrival and then again in the examination room. But one of the first issues he identifies, if we're relying on temperature checks to make us feel safer, we really aren't sure what fever to look for. As Consumer Reports says, scientists have not identified a specific fever pattern tied to this disease. We also don't agree on what an actual fever is. I'm sure you've heard this before, Pat. There are definitions from the CDC and WHO saying a person has a fever when their temperature rises above 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. This definition comes from the research of German physician Karl August Wunderlich, who used 19th century data to establish 98.6 as normal body temperature. As I've learned, there's been a long-standing debate amongst medical professionals whether that number is correct, and we do currently know that normal body temperature is more like 97.5 degrees. Add to this that a 2014 literature review by the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health found issues with non-invasive thermometers, resulting in wrong temperature readings. A device that measures temperature in the ear, for instance, is proven to be way more accurate than, say, a thermal scanner at an airport or the no-touch infrared thermometer I mentioned earlier. Simply put, by Mother Jones's Fernanda Echevarri, temperature checks just won't catch everyone who has COVID-19. She cites epidemiologist Mackenzie Wise, who's an infection prevention clinical program manager with Wolters Kluwer Health. And he notes, as we've heard before, many carriers are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic when their temperature is taken. So right off the bat, we know the temperature screenings only pick up on a subset of infected people. In fact, and this kind of blew my mind, a recent study which I linked to in JAMA looked at 5,700 COVID-19 patients hospitalized in 12 New York City area hospitals. Pat, what percentage of people do you think actually showed a fever at triage?
So these are people who actually have COVID-19?
Hospitalized for COVID. Yeah, they're COVID patients.
Yeah, I'd be guessing, but let's say 65%?
30% had a fever at triage. As for my question, what happens if you get a temperature check and you have a fever? Well, checkers, not much outside of perhaps being denied entry. As Shannon Palis says in Slate, there aren't any temperature police who will come and arrest you for being out while sick. The CEO of a supermarket chain here in Canada named T&T told the Toronto Star, quote, "Anyone with a fever will kindly be asked to rest at home and contact their healthcare provider." Important side note, T&T supermarket temperature checks are voluntary to customers, so whether they are done or enforced are left up to the stores. CDC guidelines in the US say temperature checks are a, quote, optional strategy that employers may use. Now, there are several reasons we have fevers as well that have nothing to do with infectious disease. Strenuous exercise can raise your body temperature, so if you've gone for a good jog before you hit a store requiring a temperature check, you may get turned away. Echevarri asks in her article, are temperature checks sort of just security theater for the coronavirus era then? The answer is kinda. Monitoring temperatures alone isn't going to curb the spread of COVID-19 or other diseases for that matter. Temperature checks should be considered another tool in the COVID-19 toolbox, especially in the absence of proper testing. And Charles Powell, who is the CEO of the Mount Sinai National Jewish Health Respiratory Institute, says, I don't think they're a bad idea. I don't think they're counterproductive. I think we just have to be cognizant of how we interpret it. So, if you can take anything useful away from this, as Palis concludes, quote, don't take temperature checks as a reason to head to an Apple store for kicks. Conversely, if your local supermarket doesn't have temperature checks, that's not a reason to freak out.
Interesting. Adam sent us an article where the NBA are going to start wearing these rings that
Yes.
they're saying that they claim that they can predict COVID within 3 days at 90% or 95%, which is something we'll probably have to look into on the show. But I think it was mostly based on whether or not the person had a fever. So
yeah, 90% sounds a bit high for any device like that. But I haven't dug into that, but really interesting.
Well, thanks, Cristina. And with that, we will throw things to Darren and Adam. I hope everyone out there is taking care, and we will talk to you soon.
Stay safe, everybody.
Hello, listeners. Hope you're doing all right. I had planned to discuss whether police body cameras work this week, but then something popped up and I wanted to discuss that, namely complications with the concepts of evidence and context. The issue follows from my previous segment about talking about difficult topics, and I'll once again hope to be empathetic and try to understand where different people are coming from. In that last segment, I had mentioned that depending on which social group you find yourself in, you might think issue X should get more attention compared to issue Y, and this could cause problems in various ways, but especially if your actual social group is not what you thought it was, because then it seems like you're caring too much about the wrong thing. I also said this is what happens on social media, as many people have open posts. Now with that preamble out of the way, let's look at the particular example I have in mind. My main source is a piece by Jonathan Chait in New York Magazine's The Intelligencer, linked in the show notes at trcpodcast.com. And Chait had a great introductory paragraph, so I'm going to quote that in full. Quote, David Shore is a 28-year-old political data analyst and social democrat who worked for President Obama's re-election campaign. On May 28, Shore tweeted out a short summary of a paper by Princeton professor Omar Wasow. The research compiled by Wasow analyzed public opinion in the 1960s and found violent and nonviolent protest tactics had contradictory effects. Chait then shares Shore's tweet of May 28. Reminder, George Floyd's death was May 25th. This is the tweet. Post-MLK assassination race riots reduced Democratic vote share in surrounding counties by 2%, which was enough to tip the 1968 election to Nixon. Nonviolent protests increase Dem vote, mainly by encouraging warm elite discourse and media coverage. Shore got backlash for this. Chait shares, for example, a tweet by Ari Trujillo Wessler, who founded a Democratic canvassing app and has vote by mail in their Twitter name, saying, quote, "This take is tone deaf, removes responsibility for depressed turnout from the 68 party, and reeks of anti-blackness." To which Shore replied, tweeting, "The mechanism for the paper isn't turnout, it's violence-driving news coverage that makes people vote for Republicans. The author does a great job explaining his research here." It links to the research again. Then Wessler accused Shore of anti-blackness and other issues, and complained to Shore's CEO at Civis Analytics. Che then reports that, quote, "Some employees and clients on Civis Analytics complained that Shore's tweet threatened their safety," end quote. Shore apologized, saying in another tweet, "While I strongly admire," this is Omar Wessler's Twitter handle, "his work, it's clear that I have not been, both due to my background in words, an effective messenger of his findings about the power of nonviolent protest. I regret starting this conversation and will be much more careful moving forward." That was on May 29th, 30 hours after the original tweet. A few days later, Shore was fired. We don't know why he was fired, and we don't want to commit the post hoc fallacy after that, therefore because of that, so we should preserve judgment. That said, my provisional belief is that this was due to the tweet, Occam's razor, and all that sort of thing. Regardless of the firing, though, why was this such an issue? Well, first, who is this Omar Wessler anyway? Does it matter that he was born in Kenya, his mother's African-American, father German-Jewish, and that Wasow earned a PhD in African-American studies from Harvard? Well, it matters in the sense it sounds like he's credentialed. You usually don't get a PhD from Harvard for nothing. Beyond that, it shouldn't matter if he's half black or not, but some people care about these things. But in this case, we have Shore, a data scientist who wants to elect Democrats, tweeting out data which might be relevant to electing Democrats, and another person who wants to elect Democrats being livid about it and calling the other person anti-black. Now, many of the replies took Shore's tweet as an affront to protesters. One shouldn't read the comments, but that's probably what this conversation is about. So one of them said, "This isn't easy to say if you're not living with genocide every day," such is the hyperbole of the internet. But all of this links back to my comment before about people assuming others can't hold multiple views on a complex subject, or that the comment says more than it does. There is no should or should not in Shore's tweets. Now, I can't be entirely naive here. He posted it for a reason, thinking it might be relevant, but any good researcher would know just because something is true in the 1960s or early 70s does not necessarily mean it carries over 30, 40, 50 years later. What do people assuming? What was his presumption? Hard to know what everyone means and thinks unless you can sit down with them and talk to them in detail. Did Shore misunderstand the research? No. Wasow tweeted back at Shore thanking him for reading the research closely. I think this is important, and I want to point out how wonderful this is because most science reporting is lacking in accuracy and nuance. And this was just a simple tweet, which was a concise summary. Good for you. Now, we're trying to be empathetic here, so what is the issue? I think it is best summarized in a recent current affairs piece by Nathan J. Robinson, who's providing a critique of a piece by Matt Tabibi about, media and the left and reasonability. Robinson wrote, and I'm going to quote in full here, it's a long quote, "If Shore was indeed fired over a bad tweet, I don't think he should have been. Still, people criticize Shore for quite valid reasons. The social science research suggesting that riots are not, quote, politically effective, quote, is bad research. And when the criticisms were put to Shore, he didn't seem to understand why people were upset." This is a long bracket, but here you go. It's bad research, by the way, because what it does is single out the political effect of riots in a way that allows people to blame inner-city rioters and ignore other causes. So it argues that violence fuels negative media coverage, which fuels a political backlash that helps Republicans, which might be true empirically, but as Martin Luther King pointed out, it's grotesquely immoral to make the conversation about rioters rather than looking at what causes rioters to do what they do. Yes, one way to frame the facts is riots help Republicans. But why blame the rioters instead of the media for doing the coverage that causes the backlash? Why blame the rioters instead of blaming those who have created a tinderbox in American cities through centuries of racist policies? Why single out the riots' contribution to changes in the Democratic vote share rather than the failure of Democrats to adequately appeal to enough voters? This sort of finding, presented in isolation, seems to pin responsibility on the least powerful, least wealthy people for an outcome that had many causes, and that's why people object when data nerds pull up charts that say, actually violence is not politically effective. I don't think the data nerds should be fired. They know not what they do, but people have just cause for being annoyed by this sort of purely empirical, this is in quotes, statement, which is not purely empirical at all, but reflects a values-driven decision to discuss some factors rather than others. End bracket and end quote. There's a lot to unpack in there. I think Robinson raises many good points about how many factors are involved, and I agree that one shouldn't focus on one thing, for that would be committing the single cause fallacy, something we try to warn about on the podcast. It's very tempting to do it yourself, you can see other people do it, and it's hard not to presume other people are also doing it. But are people actually committing that fallacy? Well, probably. Many people are. Many people are disingenuous. Many people don't even know what they think and they contradict themselves, so they're also probably committing the single cause fallacy. But I think it actually goes to this larger question about expectations for how anyone could discuss anything. Most people who do research focus on a narrow field of study. Of course, that's how you find out interesting facts about the world. Generalists don't get to be experts because the world is too complicated. If someone's main area is X, you can of course say that Y is also an important variable, but often that is the domain of another researcher because humans can only do so much, and most papers are about particular subjects. Of course, we want things to be interdisciplinary, but it's hard for interdisciplinarians to compete with people who are experts on a particular subject. Taking a larger step back, I wonder if this is a larger difference between science and humanities? So both groups are trying to understand the world, but using relatively different methods. So in science, you're often trying to isolate and simplify different variables, perhaps in a laboratory setting, or with simplifications and assumptions to understand certain trends or information, and then trying to add more detail to see where they can generalize outwards. So physicists, for example, if you're thinking about a ball rolling down a hill, or perhaps even astronomers looking at the Earth, you're like, well, treat the ball like a point. Well, treat the Earth like a point. It's easier for gravity calculations, of course. Well, of course, the Earth is not a point. It's a big, large oblate spheroid. But that's what you start with. And people who do this math thinks, well, it's approximate. We know it's not quite true, but unless you need to bring in those variables for other reasons, you don't need to include it. And so in many different scientific domains, you are specifically trying to isolate variables of interest to see what affects what. You're not trying to lack context because everything's connected. But it is a bit more of a structured approach of isolating to then understand and then adding complexity. Perhaps. Someone can write in. So when I think of a question of whether U.S. housing policies are racist, I think this is important. But it's a different question than whether riots affect voter turnout, which is itself a different question than how to appeal to different voters. I currently believe and hope different researchers are studying all of these things, but it isn't necessarily the case that they're all the same researcher. So do we want some people to look at all this stuff? Do we want them to do it in combination? Do we want there to be some synthesis and analysis and overall understanding of phenomena? Of course we do. Would I expect one researcher to do all that? No, of course not. What about tweets? Well, tweets are very short little things, as you know. They're usually about one subject, if they're about anything at all, and there usually isn't that much room for context. To say that the research or the tweet about the research is bad is, in my opinion, to misunderstand the nature of the world and a terrible definition of bad research. Given that he said it might be empirically sound, and then it's still bad, that's concerning. So it certainly shifts the notion of what bad might mean. Repeating for emphasis, context matters. Of course it matters. But it matters what we mean by the word context. Now here on the show, we often criticize when findings and statistics are presented out of context to mislead someone. But that is different than arguing one's research isn't sufficiently broad. Of course, you can say the research only focuses on issue X and one should look at more variables. Great, I fully agree. But just because some research isn't about all sociopolitical variables doesn't make it bad research. Or at least I don't think that's how we should use the term bad. On the other hand, if Shore and Omar disagreed with all the questions Robinson raised, like these things aren't relevant at all, then, I think that would be an issue, and that would be a bit silly and naive of them. But there's no evidence either of them thinks that. And just to give you a sense of what Waslow was actually trying to study, this is from one of the abstracts. I hypothesize protest tactics influence how news organizations frame demands. Evaluating black-led protests between 1960 and 1972, I find nonviolent activism, particularly when met with state or vigilant repression, drove media coverage, framing, congressional speech, and public opinion on civil rights. Counties proximate to nonviolent protests saw presidential Democratic vote share increase 1.6 to 2.5%. Protester-initiated violence, by contrast, helped move news agendas, frames, elite discourse, and public concern towards social control, which then led to a shift towards republicanism. So you could say it's a bit narrow, but he is looking at media coverage, how things are framed, how congressional speeches work, and public opinion on civil rights. That seems pretty broad. Now, is this a paper about systemic racism for why people act that way? No, it's not. Is either Waslow or Shore saying these people should be blamed? I don't see any evidence of that whatsoever. So I want to focus now on Robinson using the word blame. I don't want to be coy here, because you could say that's what they're implying, but I think that's more what Robinson's inferring. And I don't want to necessarily project my own thoughts about blame and the nature of causality, because I know I have atypical views about free will and responsibility, but to say that this research is blaming people in a particular way seems misguided at best. I honestly feel this is a bit like shooting the messenger. Like someone saying, hey, you know that goal you have? I have a similar goal. This particular strategy you're doing might make it less likely for you to achieve that goal, and here are some evidence and some reasons. And they respond with, why do you hate poor black people? Whoa, what? I don't think that's fair. You could say this is not the time for that type of conversation because people are engaged in a certain practice, and that might be more reasonable. But it's not even saying that one shouldn't protest. It's just offering some insight into how things went 40 to 50 years ago and how that might be something one wants to take into account, as if everyone takes scientific research into account when they're thinking about social movements. So now at this point, I can acknowledge I may be coming close to one of those data nerds Robinson speaks dismissively about, as I think one can do research, which then contributes to the broader context, and perhaps other researchers can synthesize across several different domains. Robinson might again say, but why focus on this versus something else? Well, I don't think this is entirely fair either. We just have to ask Omar. He's been studying civil rights movements in the 1960s because I guess that's something he thought was interesting. Should this be a discussion about what research gets funded? Well, it could be. That seems a bit like an odd tangent. I think all topics are connected, but we have to have some, at least temporary, parameters for discussions or where they will bifurcate endlessly. Also, in general, when people talk about a particular research interest, if you ever read a paper by a molecular biologist or an economist, it is so technical and narrow, one might wonder why anyone is doing anything at all. All that to say is that if the indictment against this research is that it is not sufficiently broad or is focused on the wrong thing, that might be true to be lodged as a complaint against most of academia. Of course, I can recognize that a main problem is that we live in a world where one's allies might agree, if they do, that certain facts are important, but because they will be used by one's enemies, that those facts shouldn't exist or be reported. Now, I'm sympathetic to this, and I am. But I think it's the wrong approach, and it risks undermining any goal that one is trying to achieve. If we don't try to focus on what's true, I think all is lost. Again, this is a question of tactics and not a goal. So instead of condemning this as bad research, the response could be that this is important research, but we also need more research on related issues A, B, and C. And additionally, I feel I have to mention, I thought Robinson loses some credibility when he selectively mentions Martin Luther King's words. Robinson mentions Martin Luther King saying it's grotesquely immoral, and I think it's these particular words. Quote, "It is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without, at the same time, condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention. And I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard." Well said. Now, morally responsible, slightly different phrasing. Okay, that's a speech. I think it's true when you're giving that type of work. But to think every scientific paper that's looking at one thing should also say racism is bad, I don't think that's something we want to start doing. And if we're tweeting scientific research, I also don't think we want to start saying, by the way, racism is bad, tacking on the end of it, because there's many things that are bad, and when would you stop that list? But the main point is that Martin Luther King also said, the limitation of riots, moral questions aside, is that they cannot win, and their participants know it. Hence, rioting is not revolutionary, but reactionary because it invites defeat. It involves an emotional catharsis, but it must be followed by a sense of futility. Now, does that matter? Well, once you're quoting Martin Luther King, then it should be clear he had nuanced views on the topic, like most people do about most things. So, what to make of all this? Did I fall prey to what I warned about last week? Namely, some people being mad on Twitter about something, and that's driving disproportionate attention to something, like me doing a podcast segment about it. I don't think so. I think it's a concerning issue of presenting data about a subject and being told it is bad because it doesn't have enough context, when that criticism could be lodged against almost all research. And while this may not be representative of most research that's being tweeted, the fact that something, which I think is important and useful, was seen as racist in some broad sense of the term, is highly problematic. I think it's important to be highly aware of how these things are understood and how they become part of a larger public discourse. So Shore's piece was picked up by Matt Tabibi and then the response. So this is now an example of something that's either good or bad or is right or wrong in the media. And I want to provide you more context about exactly what happened so you can make a more informed decision for yourself. As well, if you do think this is concerning, it is important to start pushing back on whether things like this are valid and why they may or may not be. Because if this is the trend line, things are only going to get worse unless there's some sort of pushback. And finally, I'll leave it as an exercise for the listener if they think the same criticism would have applied if it turned out that violent protests increased Democratic turnout. Until next time, think better to act better.
What's up, cuboids? As many listeners will likely remember, there was a big deal about the world ending in 2012. As any listeners who were into skepticism and critical thinking at the time will recall, this was all nonsense. It pointed to some Mayan prophecies, a non-existent planet called Nibiru, and maybe some sort of planetary alignment which wasn't really happening. Well, a few news articles have been making the rounds in the past week claiming that we did the math wrong and the world will actually end on June 21st, 2020. Now, I'm so confident that this is total nonsense that I've prepared and recorded this segment anyway, knowing very well that if the world does in fact end on Sunday, June 21st, 2020, you will probably not hear this. So why are you, dear listener, still alive? Well, there are a lot of reasons. Let's ignore for a moment that there was never really a Mayan end-of-the-world prophecy for 2012. It was a big to-do about the way their calendar works, and it was never meant to be the end of the world. But what we're talking about here all traces down to something which doesn't exist, and by that I mean some deleted tweets. Many articles on the topic flat out say that the tweets warning of the end of the world in 2020 no longer exist. The original article was in Mirror in the UK, and that article also no longer exists. Luckily, I was able to plug the article's URL into the Wayback Machine at archive.org, and I could see the original article, which had pretty much the same information as a bunch of other articles have, but it's nice to see the original source. The tweets in question no longer exist, and the Twitter account by the user who posted them has also been deleted. An article in Mysterious Universe said that they were contacted by this user who said he made the tweet in jest. He also offered a correction which matches to some of the math that I'll get to later in my segment. As the user has gone to great lengths to remove his name from this story, I've opted not to name him as it won't add any value to my coverage. Here are the tweets as quoted from the Mirror article. Following the Julian calendar, we are technically in 2012. The number of days lost in a year due to the shift into Gregorian calendar is 11 days. For 268 years using the Gregorian calendar, 1752 to 2020 times 11 days equals 2,948 days. 2,948 days divided by 365 days per year equals 8 years. The Mirror article also then states, according to this theory, June 21st, 2020 should actually be December 21st, 2012. Now, I don't see any quoted tweet with the June 21st date mentioned. Now, as I said, the tweets don't exist anymore. They've been deleted. I couldn't find any archive of them. So I don't know if the original poster did mention the date of June 21st or just kind of said, we're in 2012. So does this make sense? Well, sort of. When I was reading a lot of articles about this on Saturday, June 13th, the repeated claim was not questioned by any of these journalists. Before we get into the specifics, let's just notice that the math is actually wrong, since 2,948 divided by 365 gives 8.0767, and it repeats with some numbers, which is 8 years and 28 days. 28 days doesn't get us from December 21st to June 21st. He also missed that a year is actually 365.25 days. If calculating leap years, this gives us 8 years and 26 days. There's actually an extra fraction to factor in beyond that quarter day, which is the whole reason the Gregorian calendar exists in the first place. Few ways to talk about how wrong this is here. For one, if the Julian calendar and Gregorian calendar really were off by 11 days, then we probably would have noticed a long time ago, as the seasons would get so out of sync that they'd have a complete rotation after 33 years. Basically, we'd go from summer becoming winter, becoming summer again over a period of 33 years. That would have been very obvious. After only a quarter of that, around 8 years, all of the seasons would have shifted over by one, so summer wouldn't be summer anymore. The truth is, the Julian calendar wasn't off by 11 days per year. It just used a different way to calculate leap years, so it was off by a fraction of days per year. This added up to roughly 11 days at the time the Gregorian calendar was finally adopted. There was a one-time removal of 10 to 13 days, which was done in different places as the calendar was adopted at different times around the world. In fact, this was done over hundreds of years, with some European countries first adopting it in 1582, removing only 10 days, and Turkey being the last to adopt it in 1927, removing 13 days. Had the calculations about the 11 days a year been correct, by the time Turkey adopted the calendar, they would have been out of date with the first European countries who adopted it by around 3,795 days, which works out to be over 10 years. So, why was the Mayan prediction off by only 8 years? Because the start date used in that math, 1752, was simply the date when North America adopted the Gregorian calendar, so skipping 11 days. In his correction to Mysterious Universe, the user who originally tweeted did clarify that the number of days was 11 and not 2,948, so he realized at some point that it wasn't 11 per year, it was 11 total. Great. So when does the end of the world actually happen in the Julian calendar? December 8th, 2012. But wait, are we looking at that backwards? The assumption is that the prophecy said December 21st, 2012, which in the Julian calendar works out to be January 3rd, 2013. Also, a date that's long gone. But this is all nonsense. No Mayan prophecy ever specifically stated that the world would end on December 21st, 2012. They didn't look at either a Julian or Gregorian calendar to make this prediction. The so-called end of the world was simply the end of a time period called a Baktul in the Mesoamerican long count calendar. This is known as the Mayan calendar because they are a well-known civilization that used that calendar. December 20th, 2012 was the end of the 13th Baktul, as December 21st would be the start of the 14th Baktul. These time periods are calculated in days, not years, by going back to a mythical creation date which corresponds to August 11th, 3104 BCE in the proleptic Gregorian calendar. Right, so this date uses the Gregorian calendar, but since that calendar was only adopted starting in 1582, we have to retroactively assign a date of what that calendar would have used back then. This can cause conflicts when other calendars at the time are compared to it and don't use the same date. All of this to say, one simple point, which really torpedoes the whole revised prophecy date, as the Wikipedia page on the Mesoamerican long count calendar shows us, the date of the start of the 14th Baktul was calculated in the Gregorian calendar. So no conversion is necessary. We are using the Gregorian calendar, and that's what they originally calculated the date in. The Mayans did not predict that the world would end on December 21st, 2012, or June 21st, 2020 for that matter. We simply calculated that their calendar would enter a new period on December 21st, 2012. This was always calculated using the Gregorian calendar, so there's nothing remotely important about June 21st, 2020. Even if there was some issue with the wrong calendar being used, this would only change the date by 13 days. There's no math that gets us to June 2020. Even the bad math from the deleted tweets gives us roughly 8 years, but doesn't specifically bring us to June 21st, 2020. It's nonsense, compounded with confusion, mixed with bad math, and layer upon layer of lazy, non-critical, irresponsible reporting by the media. Peace out, cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter @TRC_podcast.